This is Pastor Stuart Waterhouse with 10 minutes after midnight. Today we'll be doing a multi-part series on sacrifice, and especially human sacrifice. I am an expert on the subject. I have attended animal sacrifice rites. I have studied very closely the theology of human sacrifice, explored human sacrifice temples, and actually in the background you'll see one of my brown goats. Her name is Pt1. She came from the city of refuge. Captain Cook dropped her off there when human sacrifice was still being practiced here in Hawaii. And just think of what her ancestors at that heiau, because that's where she was born and grew up until she came to live with me, witnessed hundreds of human sacrifice. So I named her Pt1, which means sacred goat. This is Ashley. Ashley is a sacrificial animal. She's my pet, just like Pt1 is, but she's a little lamb. And sometimes lambs were sacrificial animals. In prehistory, it was a pig. And today's part one, we'll be dealing with prehistory and the origin of human sacrifice. Here, do you want down, Ashley? Let's let Ashley down. Yeah, she's going to complain about it. Buddy, are you going to be good? Yeah, sometimes you were a sacrificial animal too. So basically, human sacrifice, money, and fertility were all intertwined from the beginning of the dawn of time. So basically, pre-creation, everything was considered the unordered realm, the dark realm, the chaotic ocean, the chaotic sea where nothing existed, and just a place of nothingness. And of course then you have the progenitor God who moved upon the waters, and he inseminated the waters, and from then land emerged, and from the emergent land then would become the ordered realm. And this was re-symbolized throughout history, where the king would conquer the barbarians and bring order to the land, and he would expand his kingdom. It was considered a creationary event. Okay, the emergent island would be the creation, and everything else would be the ocean, which would be the unordered realm, which would be the pre-creation. And God was pictured as moving against the unordered realm and bringing order to it, and thus establishing creation, and the land would emerge from chaos. So when you look along the seashore, you find shells, and there's one in particular that is of interest here, and that's the cowrie shell. The cowrie shell looked round, obviously pregnant, right? And the bottom side of the shell looked like a woman's vagina. And so the cowrie shell became a symbol of fertility. Because it was a symbol of fertility, which would represent the creation, right? Because the shell was impregnated, about to give birth, and it was on the shore of where the land would emerge. So it became a money, if you will. Cowrie shell was the first type of money. Worldwide, not just in the islands. And for example, in ancient Egypt, the cowrie hieroglyph represented gold. China's first coin had a cowrie shell on the coin. So this was money. Now at some point it dawned on ancient man that the mouth of the cowrie shell, which I said looked like a vagina, the closest resemblance to that was the pig's vagina. I don't know how they made the connection, but they did. And of course in Latin, porcelain, from the shell, pork would be the pig, the porcellana. And so the pig became a representative of that shell. And we'll get to that in a moment, but let's back up now. So let's say you had an apple tree, and I want an apple, and we would argue over the apple tree. Whoever had the biggest stick, of course, won the apple. So it's literally an argument ad baculum. Whoever had the biggest male appendage got the apple, right? But this began to change, because how could a baby, fight for that apple on an equal terms? Couldn't. So the parent would gain the apple and provide it to the baby, or to their child. And this became a parental-child covenant relationship. That was then extended to the tribe, so that the whole family would be the tribe, of course, where they all had that inner covenant to provide the apple from the strongest of them to the weaker of them. And so you had an early covenant relationship. And eventually this developed into intertribal relationships. I had the apple tree, So-and-so had the orange tree, I could trade apples for the orange. Because they're tired of oranges, they wanted an apple. And I'm tired of apples, I wanted an orange. So we made a trade, right? And then the cowrie shell became the medium of trade. And there was a reason for that now, is that because the pig became equated with the cowrie shell, then the pig would become the first sacrifice. So what happened is, when a covenant was made that I would trade, let's say I had a whole lot more apples, you only had a few oranges, I would trade 3 apples for 1 orange. It might be vice versa on different seasons. And in the covenant, of course, you would shake hands on it, although in those days they shook hands by putting their hand under the thigh, literally pledging to the covenant by their posterity. Again, it went back to fertility, of which the pig then ended up representing, because the pig looked like the cowrie shell. So what would happen is then, when the covenant was made, it was sealed by killing a pig. That became the first sacrifice. And the reason is the pig was representative of what would happen to the person that broke this contract, this covenant. It would be thus to him who breaks the contract. And that's why contracts were always made with the spilling of blood, as you read in the book of Exodus, because it was that way in most pre-ancient religions. It's thus to the lawbreaker, they would be killed. The pig was just a type of that, a symbol of the actual human sacrifice that would happen. Now, then at some point, of course, you'd need an arbitrator of this covenant, somebody who would seal it. And of course, that would develop the religious priesthood. And he would kill the pig, and that would be thus to him who breaks the covenant. And of course, the priest would take his share as well, and he'd be the arbitrator of that covenant. Now, a covenant has to be entered into voluntarily. You can't force a covenant, because then it wouldn't be a true covenant, it would be fraud. So consequently, the sacrifice had to be voluntary too, which is why in ancient times the priest would put a grain of wheat in the pig's ear, and then the pig would bow his head as he's being led out to be sacrificed, and that bowed head would look like submission. In other words, the pig was volunteering because he was submitting to the sacrifice. In fact, even today, in sacrifices, say in certain Muslim cultures, when they kill, the animal has to volunteer. So quite often they would say the name of Allah or the name of Yahweh. They actually say it doesn't matter, just use God's name, and the animal would submit to be killed. And he volunteered to be the sacrifice. And it's very interesting, over, say, thousands of years, these animals being a sacrifice in which God's name was pronounced over the animal, those that submitted obviously were preferred. And so over time, I guess there's a learned behavior inbred into these animals so that they do submit. I've seen it where they lay the hand on the animal, say Yahweh, and the animal just lies down and submits. It's a fascinating topic. And so this is how sacrifice developed. Our next episode, part 2, we'll talk about sacrifice in the Bible. It's much more prevalent in the Bible than most people realize. And of course, then in the future part, we'll see how it's the basis of all religion, including Christianity. Jesus was our human sacrifice, the sacrifice of God. There's different theories of the origin of human sacrifice. I gave the covenant theory. I just explained the covenant theory and how that developed. But there's also the mimesis hypothesis as to how human sacrifice originated. Here the idea is that they would argue over the apples, that would create violence, and violence in the end had to be ameliorated, and that would be ameliorated through a sacrifice, and then all would go back to normal. The problem with this theory of humiliation, it required mimicking, in which case everybody would mimic the same apple. You weren't just happy with a apple, you wanted the same one. And so the theory kind of falls apart, especially it doesn't sustain itself, because over time the human sacrifice would have to be more and more frequent until the whole system crashed. So I reject that theory. Another competing theory is the agrarian hypothesis. This is put forward by some anthropologists. And here it has to do with fertility. The king who establishes the realm, it's through the king's blessing that the rain comes and the crops grow. But over time, as the king ages, he loses his virility, and then maybe there's a drought, right? So the king would need to have his virility restored. And in restoring his virility, you'd have to take the virility of other people. So therefore, human sacrifice is instituted. they had in ancient Egypt the Sed festival, where the pharaoh would be rejuvenated in his 39th year of his reign, and it'd be a whole festival of this. But again, we don't really see human sacrifice too much in agrarian societies. So I reject this theory. It just doesn't hold up across the world. So I think the covenant, contractual, when the pig was killed as a contract was made, would be the most logical and the most seen across cultures. So stay tuned and look for part 2. This is 10 minutes after midnight. Goodbye.